things I've learned over the last 10 years prosecuting domestic violence is that we're likely never going to get to a point in this community where victims are going to be able to actively participate in the prosecution of domestic violence cases. There's a variety of reasons. Most importantly, her safety is usually at risk, especially if the perpetrator is out on bond and he has easy access to her or his family has access to her. There's a whole variety of safety concerns that come into play that for her become more important than the prosecution of this case. Somewhere between 60 to 80% of victims in domestic violence prosecution are not going to actively participate in that prosecution. And in fact, asking a victim to leave that relationship, which generally tends to be the answer inside the community for domestic violence victims, really increases the chances by 75% that she's going to be a victim of homicide. So what we need to start doing is to avoid that instinct to ask why she stayed, why is she in this relationship, and focusing on her and shifting the conversation to what we can do to prevent this from happening, what we need to do to hold the offender accountable. Those types of questions is where this community needs to shift their focus. And certainly in the criminal justice system, we need to be doing the same thing. I remember hearing an advocate at a training once say, never make a domestic violence victim a witness to her own crime. And it always resonated with me. And after that training, I spent a long time trying to figure out, well, how do we do that in the criminal justice system where we rely heavily on witness testimony to a judge or a jury in a trial? And the key really is what we call evidence-based prosecution, which is essentially techniques that allow us to collect evidence, both law enforcement and people in the law enforcement community, in domestic violence cases to convict the abuser without the cooperation of the victim, usually after that night. And this is something that we do all the time in murder cases where we have a victim who is deceased and obviously can't testify. And what we do is it allows us to not place additional pressure on the victim so that she can do whatever she needs to do to be safe during the pendency of that case. And we can do our job as law enforcement officers and prosecutors and judges and juries to look at the evidence in a way that is more focused on the evidence, not on her. It obviously doesn't seek to remove her interests from the criminal justice system. Rather, it seeks to refocus us on the crime, not so much on relying on her participation. And as I mentioned, that's something we do all the time in murder cases. We then usually in a trial will have an expert witness come and testify about domestic violence and about the complicated dynamics and victim and perpetrator behavior. And the way we've really implemented this in Travis County is by incorporating a lot of interagency collaboration, prosecutors working with law enforcement and communicating to them the types of things that we need to have collected the night of the incident. Because what we very quickly learned after there was a lot of training with detectives is, unlike a robbery stranger case where that victim's going to come in 4, 5, 6 days later and give a statement to the detective, family violence victims aren't going to do that. So whereas first responders traditionally are first responders and not investigators so much, what we have done is started to train first responders so that they are able to collect evidence in the same way a detective would, and to ask questions in a way that maybe a prosecutor might, so that we get all the evidence we need to prosecute that crime that night, and then we can let her go, remove herself from the criminal justice system, and then the burden is really on the state to prosecute these crimes. One of the best examples we've done over the last few years to implement this type of technique is introducing the strangulation supplement into patrol officers' hands. What we found is that perpetrators who strangle their intimate partners leave that victim at an increased risk of homicide, and it's a technique that's used to gain power and control over the victim by letting her know he's capable of killing her. And the way we have seen that change is when the law was implemented in 2010, we had about 19 strangulation cases a month. And over the last 4 years since the implementation of that supplement a year ago, we're now accepting and filing about 40 cases a month. In addition, it has drastically increased the quality of these cases. So different techniques like that are going to allow us to be more successful in prosecuting these crimes by just relying on what she's willing to tell us that night and not depending on her later down the road when it may not be safe for her to do so.